Since 2008, companies that have been given a rating of bad governance have outperformed those rated as having good governance in the stock market. So yes, I've been a consultant and I've been an investor and I've been an advisor and I've been an author and I've been a repeat author and I've been a founder. I've founded other things. I've been a co-founder. I've been an adjunct person helping other people realize their dream. And I've had my share of success and my share of failures. Nothing I've done has become Facebook. Okay, so people sometimes are like, why should I listen to you? You're not Mark Zuckerberg. I'm like, hey, no problem. One of the biggest myths in the world is that ruthless, exploitative, anti-human business practices are more profitable than the alternative. It's just not true.
Welcome to Brave. Learn from Southeast Asia's best tech leaders. Build the future, learn from our past, and stay human in between. No BS on success. I'm Jeremy Au, venture capitalist, serial founder, Harvard MBA, science fiction nerd, and dad of 2 daughters. Every week, we debate startup news, interview changemakers, answer listener questions, and share personal insights. Join our movement of over 40,000 members and get transcripts, resources, and community at www.bravesea.com. Stay well and stay brave.
Hey Eric, excited to have you on the show. I'm a big fan for many years. I've read
Thank
your
you.
book, starting out as a founder, and for many years teaching as a adjunct professor. I was using your book to teach the course materials.
That's really great. Thank you so much for saying so. And thanks for your teaching.
So many founders really intuitively understand what you're saying about iteration, speed, velocity. And it's just mind-boggling to me that the school still very much focus on that. Ready, aim, fire, and it takes 6 months for you to plan it out mentality. So
Yeah,
Eric, please introduce yourself. Yeah.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. I'm Eric Ries. I'm author of The Lean Startup. That's how most people know me. I took over my life, but also have been a founder, repeat founder myself, and I've written a couple books and working on a new book that I'm excited to talk about too.
Yeah, so fantastic. So I think we're going to go through this chronologically and go back to the beginning, which is why did you decide to write the first book, Lean Startup? Was it because you were like, this is a brainwave, as a framework that came up, or how did it come about?
I'm a computer programmer, so I'm like a software guy from way back, from when I was a kid, really, programming computers. And I was in college during the dot-com bubble. That's how old I am. So I got into entrepreneurship at a time when the best practice for entrepreneurship was nothing more sophisticated than like, have a great idea, question mark, question mark, question mark, make a lot of money. We really didn't know anything about what we were doing. There was no popular discourse about startups. There wasn't a lot of online content about it. It wasn't a thing yet. And so we didn't know what we were doing. And I came out to Silicon Valley after I graduated and wanted to really learn entrepreneurship from the very best of the best. And I basically discovered that although there was an incredible apprenticeship system in Silicon Valley, like there was an incredible amount of accumulated wisdom and lore about startups, it wasn't really systematic. So when you would ask people for advice about what to do in a given situation, they would always be able to tell you, well, Steve Jobs did it like this, or Bill Gates did it like that, or your famous person. This is how Mark Benioff famously faced that situation. But I found that always very unsatisfying because I was like, well, what if I'm not Steve Jobs? Then what? What if what worked for him then, was that really going to work for me now? Like I found those stories very unsatisfying. And meanwhile, I'm trying to run a startup where I'm trying to put a new set of principles into practice. I was trying to get people to be more iterative, more scientific in their decision making, to go faster, be more efficient, and more humane. I really felt like that was a way to put humanity at the center of entrepreneurship instead of just the cold numbers and dollars. And I didn't realize at the time how revolutionary or radical people would perceive those ideas as. I thought it was just common sense to me, but oh no, people thought it was completely crazy. So it took me a long time, just in my job, just as a founder, to explain to people why we did things the way we did them, and eventually to give them vocabulary and language. And when I started writing about it and speaking about it publicly, I galvanized so many people who were excited about it. And that's ultimately what led me to write the book, was just to document what I had found helpful to me in my own career, but what so many other people were getting excited about. Yeah, so that is ultimately why I wrote the book.
What's interesting is that you wrote this book and you encapsulated all those learnings. And we're not going to recap the book here. There's so much out there. But what was that reaction like? You said it took over your life. What was that reaction like? Was it like a slow burn, it took off, or was it like a massive thing altogether? How did it come together?
Well, okay, in retrospect, I can say that it was a slow burn because I didn't know what it was going to be like. But at the time, it felt like a real whirlwind, even from the very beginning, because people were just so interested in what it was. And to me, having never really done a lot of public speaking, hadn't done public writing. I was mostly an engineer. So I
Mm.
hadn't had that experience of hundreds of people crowded into a ballroom to hear me speak before, to be able to have to answer questions on the fly, to be getting fan mail and emails and invited to speak at things like that. All that was new to me. So it felt very dramatic right off the bat. But if you look at it, it's actually very hockey stick shaped because it was bubbling around places like Silicon Valley for a while before it crossed over into the mainstream. And then once mainstream business got their hands on it, then it really became a thing. And it not only became a thing for startups all over the world, far from Silicon Valley, but also it became a playbook for lots of established companies who want to maintain or revitalize that innovation spark within
Mm.
them to embrace the ideas and find them useful.
What's interesting is that there are more books that don't succeed. Was it like the right timing, right book? You wrote it really well. How do you reflect on it today?
You never really know, and product market fit is always a little bit mysterious. But I had a lot of things going for me. The biggest thing I had going for me, honestly, was nothing to do with me at all, but the fact that I started writing this around the time of the Great Recession.
Mm.
So it was funny. I didn't understand at the time, but in retrospect, I can see how advantageous it was to be known as the lean startup guy at a time
Mm.
when every investor was telling their founders to freak out and cut costs.
Mm.
And people have thought lean means cheap, going all the way back to lean manufacturing and Toyota Production System. So it's an old misconception that I think very much worked in my favor. I think another thing that really helped, there were a lot of allied movements that had come before. Agile software development, extreme programming, software craftsmanship, DevOps, design thinking, customer development, you name it. There were all these other ideas that had intersections with lean startup. They had either the idea of iteration, the idea of customer centricity, the idea of batch size or efficiency. Anyway, so there was these different pre-existing ideas. And I really made it my business when I wrote Lean Startup to try to understand every pre-existing idea or concept that it related to and lay out those touch points and that connective tissue. And I do think that was very helpful because it allowed lots and lots and lots of other people to join the movement and not feel like Lean Startup is displacing or attacking what they believe, but rather it's an extension or an allied movement to what they're doing. I do think that was an important part of it. I hope it was also well written. I hope people also liked it because my personal story was interesting, or I don't know. You never know about those factors. But I think the underlying structural factors also mattered a great deal.
When you wrote this book, I'm just curious about your personal identity, right? Because before this, you're an engineer, you're a founder. And then obviously, even you asked me today, it's like you're an author, right? And so did your identity have to shift? Were you like, I love this author lifestyle? Or how did you approach that huge hockey shape, change of your
Oh,
life?
yeah, it was very confusing. I mean, for a long time, I didn't know what to tell people I did for a living. And everyone was always unsatisfied with it because people who thought I should embrace being an author only were like, look, you got to go become a consultant. You got to go build a consulting practice. You got to go do all this. You got to become famous. You got to be like Tim Ferriss. You got to go on TV. There's like a celebrity, public intellectual kind of path you can go down. And then people who thought I was betraying my founder roots were like, no, 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 you got to leave all that behind and just become, they were like, use all that. They were like, all that trust and goodwill you built up with people, you can use it to squeeze money out of them by being a founder and being what. So like people were constantly pitching me all kinds of stuff. I should become an investor. I should become this. But the truth is, to me, I love ideas. So the idea of it, the learning journey for me and the intellectual side of it was always really important. So that same quest to try to understand the truth of the situation has taken me into all kinds of interesting cul-de-sacs and different turns and journeys. So yes, I've been a consultant and I've been an investor and I've been an advisor and I've been an author and I've been a repeat author and I've been a founder. I've founded other things. I've been a co-founder. I've been an adjunct person helping other people realize their dream. And I've had my share of success and my share of failures. And what's interesting is nothing I've done, just to be clear for your listeners, okay, nothing I've done has become Facebook. Okay, so people sometimes are like, why should I listen to you? You're not Mark Zuckerberg. I'm like, hey, no problem. Mark Zuckerberg and Elon, these guys, they are all over the social media. You want to listen to those guys instead? They can't shut up about how great they are. So go nuts, go for it. And my little niche, my little part of this world is for people who want to try to understand what is entrepreneurship from first principles and how to apply those principles in a lot of different domains. And I know that's not for everybody, but for the people that find that interesting, then we're allies in this common cause where our quest is ultimately a new form of human knowledge, not just to make money.
Yeah. And I think touching on this book was an encapsulation of your learnings at that particular point of time, right? And all of your prior experience beforehand. And since that book has come, since the Great Recession, there's lots of changes, I would say. One angle, obviously, is the AI boom, I would say, is a very much a big macro accelerant, I think the biggest since the time
Quite a
the
big
book was
one.
written. So I'm kind of curious about that context. And obviously, we'll talk about how it also leads into your current book as well. let's go through the first angles. Like obviously we've seen the AI boom happen in terms of capability, usage, and
No, it's
even
incredible,
excitement, right? And
incredible.
how do you think the lessons or principles of lean startup translate in this new age of AI?
They're more important than ever because I've always said from the beginning that lean startup principles are really good when you have a confluence of two factors. Whenever you have an increase in the potential for velocity relative to the speed at which an underlying industry has gone before, and when you have higher uncertainty, then lean
Mm,
startup works well together. It can be uncertainty about technology, could also be uncertainty about what customers want, about consumer preference. Well, AI is an accelerant to both trends because
mm,
now you can build in a month what used to take a year. You can build in a day what used to take a month. You have this incredible acceleration of development capabilities. Although you have to be careful. There's also some pretty significant problems with those tools. Just the knowledge gap that you can close if you use AI as your teacher is really phenomenal. So the number of times I've been like, oh, I need to learn about this industry, or I'm trying to figure out how to get access to some gatekeeper. Or I want to know, just there's something you want to know. The difference between being able to really interrogate a high quality reasoning model compared to using Google is incredible. So that has lowered barriers to entrepreneurship and increased velocity across the board. And at the same time, the uncertainty is higher than ever. First of all, because technology is being disrupted by the new paradigm, but also every industry is now having new entrants. Moats that were previously completely unassailable are falling like flies. And
mm,
we haven't seen that immediate visceral disruption in a little while. So many people in business actually are not really prepared or equipped for it. As much as they preached the importance of disruption, innovation, all this stuff, I know from my experience trying to get companies to innovate, most companies are just satisfied with the moat that they have and the feeling that they can never be displaced. And so all of a sudden you have a generation of managers who have grown fat and happy on what we now, what at the time seemed like radical change, what we look back on now as a period of actually gentle stability, and are now all scrambling to figure out what to do. So yeah, a great time to be an entrepreneur.
it just made me realize that maybe like the internet boom was the slow part of the hockey stick, right? Because it seemed
Yep.
like a crazy change. Even then, it was like the idea of being able to pull up a car versus self-driving cars is a totally different game changer there. And so what's interesting is that you've done this set of learnings, you chose to write this new book. Could you share a little bit more about what were some of the learnings and why you decided to write this book?
So I'm very proud of what we've accomplished with the Lean Startup
Mm,
movement. I mean, Lean Startup was published in 2011, so it's been 15
mm,
years, and I think we've accomplished a lot in that time, including the fact that many people consider Lean Startup and its affiliated ideas to be the new orthodoxy, the new best practices in company
mm,
building. Although I get criticized for that from time to time. I'm like, well, if we're going to be the new orthodoxy, I'd appreciate if everyone would actually do it before they start criticizing. I still meet a lot of companies that are not actually following the playbook. But in any event, I think from an intellectual point of view, if you ask people for the core concepts that make up entrepreneurship, you'll hear pivots and MVPs and stuff like that. It's a very common part of how people analyze and understand startups. So I think that's a real accomplishment. But so many of the people who have built incredible companies using those techniques have nonetheless ended up miserable. And it's really, I think it's important to start with the human costs first. And even some of them are super rich today, but like not that happy about it. A lot of them have had companies taken away from them or destroyed by outside forces. A lot of them have companies that got away from them in a different sense, where they just lost control of what the company became. And now it's malignant. It doesn't reflect their values anymore. They're embarrassed about what it's become. I hear that all the time. And I think basically what happened was we taught people a new set of best practices about how to build their company, how to create product market fit from nothing, which I'm very proud of. But we didn't really teach them how to protect what they had built. And it turns out that in the world we live in today, everything that is worth protecting will eventually need protection. That
mm,
the value, the assets that these companies create are not just dollars and products and customers and employees and contracts. There's also something else. I call it trustworthiness. That
mm,
when a company is truly idealistic, when it's mission driven, when it actually tries to create something of high quality, something that is meant to last, something that is meant to make people's lives better, when it treats its employees and customers and investors with respect, such a company creates this very precious asset. I think it's the most underrated asset in the world today,
mm,
trustworthiness. And the problem is, the more you have this asset, the more valuable you are as a target. A vault full of some asset, someone's going to try to take it from you. And
mm,
unfortunately, most of the best practices that we teach founders, leaders, board members, even investors about how companies should be structured, how culture should be formed, how governance should work are designed to make them weak and easy to influence from the outside, easy to break from the outside. And so as a result, we're seeing an epidemic all around our economy, all over the world, of companies betraying what they once stood for, of customers feeling exploited, of employees being mistreated. And we call that capitalism. as if it was like the necessary part of our financial system. That is a necessary part of capitalism. It's better to understand it as a corruption of
Mm.
what capitalism could be. And so, leaving the history aside, you ask, what kind of financial system do we want to have? What kind of economic business system do we want to have in the future? I think most entrepreneurs, most founders, most employees, most customers would say, I want one that puts human flourishing at the center, that's what it's self-consciously trying to create. And whether it makes money or not is a secondary question. First question is, are people better off because we have it? Now, it turns out, as the research I show in the book demonstrates, that people who think this way also create tremendous economic opportunity, tremendous value creation, and tremendous competitive advantage. So it's not like we're giving up on making money by taking this turn. Rather, we are harnessing that desire to make money to the true mission-driven ethos of maximizing human flourishing.
What's interesting is that this is a very different target audience in some ways, right? I mean, the Lean Startup very much felt like it's a book for an audience of anybody who aspires to be a founder or aspires to build or is frustrated with management, right? So, well,
Mhm.
that's a good chunk audience. And the second thing is you're talking about people who are trying to keep what they have built true to the mission and so forth. That's a very different audience. Why do you decide to change your audience in that sense?
I don't think so. I don't actually think it is a change in the audience,
Mm,
although I do think it's an
mm,
expansion. So
mm,
my work every day, like we joke about what is it that Eric does for a living? Because I've had all these different hats and I do all this different stuff. At the end of the day, the most common thing I do is somebody calls me for advice about starting a company. I mean, really,
mm,
that's my daily
mm,
kata. That's my daily practice. And for a long time, I've tried to help them. My ethos has been be helpful. So I don't ask, are you worthy of my attention or time? I don't say, is it likely that your startup will succeed? I try to treat everybody as if I always ask myself, well, what if it succeeded? Then what? And work from there.
mm,
So I'm not evaluating startups. I'm not an investor most of the time. I'm not an evaluator. I'm trying to be a helper. And so
mm,
I've gotten a lot of practice at helping people with the issues that come up as entrepreneurs. And I used to talk only about lean startup stuff, but I started over time, started asking people, what is your vision? What is your mission? What are you trying to accomplish? Because I started working with companies that had grown large enough that I could see how early mistakes that they make ultimately led to betrayals down the road. So I started asking founders about that stuff at the beginning, and I didn't realize how incendiary these topics are for people. I've had
mm,
so many founders break down in tears or thank me so profusely just for raising the question, or honestly confess their fears to me. Like, I'm afraid of what I'm creating. I'm worried about what's going to happen in the future. I don't feel like I have the tools to protect it. And yet, when I talk to my investors, when I talk to bankers, when I talk to lawyers, they always pat me on the head and say, well, don't worry about it. You always figure that out later. It's very unsettling. So a lot of this book came out of my practice with founders. But I think of the reader for this book as broader because, of course, not all of us are startup founders. Although many of us who don't think of ourselves as founders are actually future founders, we don't know it yet. But every one of us is an employee, a customer, an investor, a board member. Like, we have these other roles with respect to organizations. And one of my big discoveries writing this book is that to see change in the best practices around how companies are structured is not something that founders alone can achieve. It requires everybody in the ecosystem, including just outside of the ecosystem who are just curious or interested. That's why I gave the title a how question and a why question both, because I want to get readers who are interested in why are companies behaving the way they are. Think about how many times a private equity firm has ruined one of your favorite brands, driven the company into bankruptcy. What was the point of that? Like, people are like, why does that happen? It seems counterproductive. It seems like it's profit or value destroying. So why are we doing it? So this is a book about why this happens. And then for those that are interested, how can it be prevented?
So let's go into the book, right? So you're doing this research, you're doing this writing. Were there any particular moments that stuck out for you in your research or something that changed your mind?
So many things. It's similar to Lean Startup in this way. A bunch of things that I found intuitive or counterintuitive, I thought were just like, well, sure, everybody knows this or thinks this. And then I was really shocked to discover what the state of the art actually is and then what the research says. So I'll give an example. One thing that I've never quite understood, like, there's a lot of governance best practices that we follow that go under the broad heading of shareholder primacy.
Mm,
And it always seemed to me like those practices, like I would see this in big companies, even public companies. I would ask people why, your company's doing something stupid. Why is it happening? And they'd be like, well, that's the best practice, or because that's what shareholders want. Like, people would point to these practices as causing all these problems. And I just thought, well, why? It's so strange. It seems like if they're causing these problems, why are they the best practice? Yet, if you talk to people, they're like really the orthodoxy everyone knows is the best practices. So here's one of my favorite stats that blew my mind in the book. Since 2008, companies that have been given a rating of bad governance have outperformed those rated as having good governance in the stock market.
Mm.
So it's
Oh,
not just
that's
my
funny.
intuition or like, oh, these practices actually destroy value. Okay, good to know. Good to know. Even though these practices, many of them are carried out in the name of shareholders and shareholder value, they are not actually in the material interests of the shareholders they purport to represent. So that was a big one and a big surprise for me. Another thing is I became a collector over the years because I built long-term stock exchange and other things. So I became a collector of obscure corporate governance forms because there's all these alternative companies out there that
Mm.
are employee owned or they're customer co-ops or they're owned by a nonprofit
Mm.
foundation. All these alternative ways of structuring companies. Even Alibaba is governed by an employee voting trust, which is like just a super interesting and unique governance model. So I was like a collector. I had a deck of cards actually I used to carry with me with all these different ideas on it. And when someone would ask me, I have this kind of a weird problem, I'm like, oh, you got a weird problem? I got a weird solution. And I would share these things with them. But at the beginning, I viewed it as my quirky hobby. It didn't seem very practical because these things, I always thought of them as when you talk to people about them, they think they're like old fashioned or small or niche or not important. Another thing that really blew my mind in the research for this is just how big these alternate practices are. If you add up employee co ops, and if you add up cooperatives, employee owned companies, certified mission driven companies, perpetual purpose trusts, and what are called industrial foundations, the total number of employees covered by those employees are in the millions. Their total market cap is in the trillions. It's probably something like 5% of world GDP is already
Mm.
in some kind of alternative governance structure, which is like mind boggling how big it is. So turns out, since it's so big, and a lot of these ideas are quite old, there's also bodies of research, reams and reams of research that have studied these alternatives up and down the line to see whether they are better or worse than our modern best practices. And they're almost universally better. So what's really fascinating to me, again, going back to the best practice, we've reified things as best practices that the data shows are actually not that great. And so a big part of what we have to do with this book, I think as leaders, founders, employees, you name it, board members, doesn't matter. All of us have to break the spell and be like, oh, we've been duped. We've been sold a bill of goods. This isn't actually the only way. There's a better way. And then from there, each organization can find its own path to the version of the alternatives that makes sense for it.
When we talk about this, that obviously triggers some debate, right? Because when we talk about best practices, we're also talking about maybe American shareholder public capital markets as best practice. So there'll be your quarterly reporting, conference calls, etc. There's also alternate governance models that you already mentioned, right? I think there's B corporations, there's social enterprises, there's nonprofits. And if you look globally, obviously, the Germans have their employees on the board. There's also state-owned enterprises, whether that's in Europe or even in America or China or anywhere in the world. Many of them are government-linked corporations where the government is either a key holder or a controlling stake. So what do you think this book adds to the variety of structures that already exist? Yeah.
It's not full of new ideas in the same way that Lean Startup wasn't really full of new ideas. There's a few, but
Mm.
most of the things that are in the book are well proven, well established. There's not only case studies of it in action, but there's also research about what those case studies show in the aggregate. 'Cause I'm always very wary of business books cherry picking their case studies. Like, come on,
Mm.
yeah, okay, so one company did that, so what? So I tried to be very rigorous about it. Where I think the book is different is, first of all, it speaks much more directly to the negative side of this. A lot of modern mission driven books are very rah rah. We just got to do better, or very pessimistic. Everything sucks and we're all going to die. And we may. That's true. Things are quite dire. So maybe. But I don't feel I'm an entrepreneur. So I can't really write in that tone. On the other hand, I felt like we have to call a spade a spade. We have to be willing to name these things. So starting with the title, I mean, just to call the behavior corruption instead of something more anodyne like mission drift or even exploitation. I was like, no, our grandparents, our great grandparents, they would have seen these business practices as corrupt. So we should just name what that is. And then not corruption in the legal or moral sense as much as more like corrosion, right? Like a bridge with
Mm.
rusty gears. They're just practices that are not well suited to structural integrity. So yeah, that's a big part of what I think the book contributes is to name things. But then once we have properly diagnosed, I call them the fundamental forces that underlie organizations. So more like the physics of organizations than the surface level things like vision or culture or even mission or org chart. This is something
Mm.
deeper, something underneath. Once we've named those forces, we can ask ourselves, now that we know what an organization truly is, now we know these forces that act on it, what are the ideal operational and governance structures? And so in the second part of the book, I try to redefine governance altogether to show how we can create a new synthesis of ideas from the operational and culture domain, as well as ideas from the legal and governance domain, to create what I call the new governance that builds organizations that are coherent and have high integrity.
This is triggering a lot of emotions for me. I studied at UC Berkeley, which is very much in love with this. There were cooperatives, credit unions, and everybody was about student government. And then the other side, I went to Harvard for my MBA, which is someone said was the West Point of capitalism. And very much the other side saying like, well, those are best practices. The job of a private company is to go public eventually, return shareholder value, and that also helps create society and so forth. So I can see that at war a little bit here. I think one part that jumps at me is that the biggest counter argument wouldn't be like, oh, we don't want to do it. I think every executive who's a business person basically says, yeah, we want to pay our employees well, we want to give back to society, we pay taxes, and we got to do the business. I think the biggest counter argument would be, hey, if we do this mission stuff, whether it's ESG, right, environmental, social, and governance, if we do this, we end up getting outcompeted by the companies that don't do that stuff, right? And I think that is probably like the biggest counter argument. It's not like we don't want to
No,
do
no,
it. It's
totally.
more like if we do it, we're going to get
This
eaten
is
alive.
taught in every business school in the world, and it goes like this. For those who have not gone to business school, let me lay out the argument, because this is like, you'll see, this is even in every microeconomics Econ 101 class. You'll sometimes hear this argument. It goes like this. And I don't know why. I think it's because of our colonial past. The story is often be like, let's say you run a plantation. I hate stories that begin this way. I'm like, whoa, we really have to make it a plantation. But like very common will be like, okay, you run a plantation. You realize that you can treat your workers well. You can pay them better. You can do all this stuff. But the plantation down the street, they don't pay their workers well. They pay them poorly. They exploit them. They use toxic chemicals, but their prices are cheaper. So everyone chooses them. So you go out of business. So your high-minded ideals ultimately lose in the marketplace. That's what supply and demand is. That's Econ 101. And it's such an interesting story, leaving the colonial part of its side, which I find very, very offensive. It's also smuggling in to the story empirically testable claims and treating them as fact. For example, it presupposes that customers always want the lowest price. It presupposes that paying employees worse will give you a lower price or a higher quality product. It's presupposing that the quality of the product doesn't really matter, and a bunch of other things. Employee turnover is not a cost. It's assuming that the toxic chemicals and the negative externalities that you cause don't matter, don't ever come back to bite you, don't show up on your balance sheet. And none of those things are necessarily true. And the way you can prove that the people who think this way don't really believe it is you can take the same argument and apply it to CEO compensation. Imagine someone said, look, we want to pay our CEO 100 times the median wage of this company, but we can't afford to do so. Why? Well, the company down the street, they might pay their CEO less and pass the savings on to consumers, and then we would be driven out of business. But they're like, no, what are you talking about? That's not right. You have to pay a premium because CEO talent is the most important skill. You're like, oh, I see. So sometimes you can get a business advantage from paying a premium wage. How interesting that it applies in this situation, but not that situation. Now, look, we can still have the business strategy conversation about, well, you could be like, well, but CEOs are more important than workers or whatever. Like, whatever you want to say about why these two situations are different is fine. But now make the argument. Okay, the point is the original story was missing all those elements. Now, when I say something is empirically testable, I don't just mean in theory. Good news, we have incredible evidence. This is a question that has been repeatedly studied, and it turns out that being a sociopathic company that treats your employees like crap creates huge competitive problems, and doing the reverse creates competitive advantages. And it's not subtle. There was one study I cite in the book, did a big meta-analysis of employee ownership, and it found not only do employee-owned companies outperform conventional companies, but that in a data set that I think involved 54,000 companies, like a huge data set, they found that employee ownership exhibits a dose response. The more employee ownership you get, the more competitiveness you get. You get faster revenue growth, you get better resilience. There's all these positive business outcomes. And we see that in many of these mechanisms, that if you adopt them, it might seem harder on the surface, but actually it makes your life easier down the road. Whereas when you race to the bottom, when you engage in conventional business practices, you wind up making yourself into a commodity and you make yourself weak and easy to disrupt. So we have lots and lots of both case studies that illustrate those points, but also like really extensive data that demonstrates it.
That makes a lot of sense. And one struggle I have is thinking through all those counter arguments that come up, right? So, you're right to say that companies can fight on price, but often they fight on innovation, speed to market, agility, all these other aspects that are so important. Though the question that people just have is, are the mechanisms you have the prerequisite to doing it, right? Because there are so many companies, for example, where you said earlier, like middle management is not innovating and not thinking through the future.
Exactly. So let's just focus on price for a second,
Mm.
because one of my favorite examples in the book is Costco. You hear people talk about Costco and with a sense of mystery about it. I was listening to an economist who was giving a big lecture about family-owned businesses. They were going through a list. Only family-owned businesses can think long-term. Only family-run businesses can resist the pressure to exploit their customers. Only they were just going on and they were listing family-run business. They were just name dropping X, Y, Z, Ford Motor Company, Toyota. It was just like one after the other family-run business. At the end of the lecture, they said, oh, and also Costco for some reason. They're not a family-run business, but they also seem to do all this stuff. And just like, anyway, moving on. The lecture is like, what? I thought the lecture was that only the family-run businesses, only and also Costco. How weird. And in fact, in most industries, there's one outlier exceptional company with an unusual structure. And I just felt like part of my goal in writing this book is to demystify this behavior. And Costco is a great example because I mentioned in the plantation example how competing on price is seen as the ultimate market mechanism that disciplines companies and forces them to be exploitative. But Costco is famously the low-cost retailer. They actually have a decisive cost advantage in spite of the fact that they treat their suppliers well. They treat their employees well. They pay their employees above average wages, and they treat their customers well. They actually see their job as being a fiduciary to the customer. So how can this be? It seems like someone should be able to come in and undercut them by doing all those things. And we have many real life natural experiments, including the predecessor to Costco. The modern Costco is like a spiritual descendant, if you will, of a company created by a guy named Saul Price, who founded something called FedMart. And FedMart is the ultimate natural experiment to prove that this theory is true, because he built the company for like 20 or 25 years on this simple formula: fiduciary to the customer, not to shareholders, 14% capped margins, so lowest price, and treating everybody in such a way that he would be seen as trustworthy. Trustworthiness as an asset is how I talk about it in the book. And eventually his investors got sick and tired of it, because they're like, man, we could make more money if we stop listening to this guy. We jacked up prices. And like, we don't have to pay workers this much. We're paying all this extra money. All they could see were the costs of his strategy, his ethos. They could not see the benefits. And so they kicked him out of the company. In 1975, he came to work one day and the locks on his door were changed. He couldn't even get into the office. And investors were thrilled. They're like, finally, this guy's out of our way. Finally, we can run the company the way we think it should be run. And would you be shocked to hear that the company was bankrupt within 7 years? So I think one of the biggest myths in the world is that ruthless, exploitative, anti-human business practices are more profitable than the alternative. It's just not true.
When we're talking about this, obviously there are many companies that also fail along the way because the founder was wrong. The founder didn't bring on the right talent in a team. I give you an example would be one of the perceived drivers of success, for example, of Boston Biotech, for example, is this perception that obviously the founder initially is the IP creator, scientist, visionary. And at some level, there needs to be talent that comes in, whether it's commercial, second command, or whether it's a new CEO to help drive that commercialization push, right? Let me give an example, right? And in Boston, it feels like it's a common practice to have that dynamic. Would you say that there's a betrayal of the founder vision? Because it feels like a blend between lean startup on one end and Incorruptible. So how does that shake out from your perspective between those two frameworks?
So you mean the phenomenon of kicking out the founder in biotech?
I wouldn't say about kicking out the founder. It's more like about that, the transition point between the right talent, right? Because founders can go wrong. They can go the wrong
I see what you're
direction.
saying.
They don't
Yeah.
pivot, et cetera.
No.
And
Yeah,
so
yeah.
but you could use the book Incorruptible and say, we just need to stick to the founder no matter what. And go straight.
You have to apply the principles. It's always been very frustrating to people. And then this is true even going back to the question of whether to pivot or not. People always want to turn it into a formula. And there are some of the techniques in the book, actually it's true in Lean Startup and in Incorruptible, that are seen by the world as pro-founder. Because I am pro-founder. I'm a founder myself. What do you expect?
Yeah.
But there's a bunch of techniques that are not. It's a mix. So people who are like absolutist, investors should rule the world, and people who are absolutist, founders should rule the world, will both be equally upset by this book. Because I actually don't think that what I call the architecture of institutional longevity should ever be about the vision or life of one person, no matter how brilliant. The goal has to be to translate those values into organizational structures that can last beyond the human lifespan. That's our ambition. So if you say we should blindly follow the founders can never be held accountable, the founders are infallible, organizations that are structured around those absolute monarchies do not have the greatest track record. First of all, sometimes you get the wrong person and you're in trouble. But even if the person is utterly, totally, completely brilliant, you still have the problem of succession. What happens when they die? And I tell a bunch of stories like this in the book, stories where the founder's son takes over and is like a total lunatic and utterly ruins the company. Like it's as old as time. I think that making it about just the founder is no good. But on the other hand, and you see this in biotech a lot, the pressure to abandon the ethos and turn to exploitation is especially dangerous because we're talking with people's lives. So I'll give you a story. And in the old days, it used to be after a company was successful, you would see the squeeze. Now we're getting it from day one. And I heard the story that just horrified me. A VC told me this story. And he was like, a founder came to see me for advice. And here's the dilemma he gave him. He was working on an implantable medical device. I won't say exactly what it was to protect his privacy, but something to correct a very serious in-body illness. And they had clinical trials and the device worked brilliantly. So they were trying to get FDA approval to manufacture and implant the device, but also to raise money to manufacture it. And they kept meeting with VCs one after the other who was like, listen, I love this business. I love how impactful it's going to be on human lives and all that stuff, but I don't like the business model that much because the device is made out of these high quality materials like stainless steel. It's going to last forever. So you're never going to get any recurring revenue. What we recommend instead is that you change out some of the parts to be plastic so that they'll need to be replaced periodically so that you'll have recurring revenue. And the guy was coming to this other VC for help, like in tears, just like, I don't want to build that company. And he couldn't raise money. He was really upset. So like we've taken this really too far. And what's so interesting is investors think they're being so savvy by doing that. As a result, this company's not even ever going to get built. On the flip side, I tell the story about the founders of Novo Nordisk who developed insulin treatments for diabetes in the 1920s. They brought the technology from Canada back to Denmark. And when they set the company up, one of their principles, it's interesting, they went to Canada because they were a husband-wife team. The wife, Marie, had diabetes herself, which at the time was a death sentence. She was a doctor. She was one of the early female doctors in Denmark. Incredible woman with an incredible life story. Her husband was a Nobel laureate. And so he was going to North America to give a series of lectures about his Nobel Prize winning research. And she went with him. Even though she was dying of diabetes, she went with him on this tour. And when they were there, they got wind that these Canadian researchers had figured out how to synthesize artificial insulin for the first time, and that it was going to be revolutionary for the treatment of diabetes. And they went to Canada. They made a detour of their trip, went to Canada, saw the technology for themselves. And they were like, we have to commercialize this in Denmark. So they made a deal with the Canadian researchers. Can we license this technology from you? And what we'll do to assure you that we have good intentions, you can trust us, we will set it up so that the technology itself is owned by a nonprofit foundation. And then we'll commercialize it in a for-profit subsidiary of the nonprofit. Why do they do this? Because everyone involved in this venture was a scientist, and they felt like science was a public trust. So they felt the idea that somebody one day would be giving you a life-saving treatment for money, and then they withhold that treatment from you to exploit you for more money was disgusting to them. They thought that was morally abhorrent. So they wanted to build a company that would never do that. And the company they built, the Nordisk Laboratorium, I can't say it in Danish. Eventually, they had a founder schism, and they were actually two companies that got created. One was called Novo, one was called Nordisk. Anyway, they had a big fight. The whole thing boiled. Anyway, but by the time the founders had died, they eventually merged not just the two companies, but the two foundations to create the modern Novo Nordisk. Novo Nordisk has lasted now more than 100 years with this simple structure. So meanwhile, these investors who think they're so savvy are telling this biotech founder that he can't create his company. Meanwhile, whenever someone is listening to people like that, I always ask them to consider, okay, I'm sure those people seem very smart and wise to you, but are you sure they're smarter than a Nobel laureate? Because these guys worked this out. August and Marie Crowe worked this out in the 1920s, and it seems to have worked pretty well. Why don't we copy their example?
As we look at this book, things have also accelerated a lot during this time, especially with technology. We're looking at the future. How do you think this book translates in the age of not just AI, but AI acceleration, right? So I think the newest talk was not just, people used to say like 1,000-person employee company, then 100-person company, then 10-person company, then a 1-person company where everyone's bots. And now I think the hottest thing is called 0-people company, where it's all AI agents and there's nobody inside. So how do you think your
It's so
principles play?
dangerous. Yeah. I have a very contrarian take on AI because I'm the founder of an AI research lab called Answer AI, where we have a thesis that the right way to use generative AI is to amplify human creativity, not to replace it. So I think a lot of the agent craze is going to crash and burn precisely because eventually these creations are going to get out of people's control. We're already starting to see like vibe coded software fail in production, and now nobody even knows how it was made. No one knows how to fix it. Because look, these models are incredibly impressive. Okay. I don't mean to poo
Mm,
poo the progress we've made in language models. It's amazing what we've been able to do. But it's a bit like the talking dog. What's incredible is that the dog talks, not necessarily that what he says. Like, it's just so incredible that a language model can write software. Now, if you had told me that 20 years ago, I would never have believed it in a million years. And I'm pretty knowledgeable about these things. It just seems incredible to me. So, what a breakthrough. Okay. I don't mean to take anything away from it. But at the end of the day, these are autoregressive models that are especially good at the things that are in the training set. And
mm,
as we build more and more stuff with them, we are creating more and more situations. We're taking them out of distribution more and more and more often. People call that hallucination, which I think is
mm,
a very unfortunate anthropomorphism, because what's going on is not a hallucination. The model's not crazy. It's just it doesn't have what it needs to make the correct token prediction to be useful to you in that
mm,
situation. So I do think this is a very transformational technology. I do think it is wonderful for entrepreneurs. It is going to open up so much entrepreneurial opportunity. But I think we have to be prepared for a lot of social disruption. And to me, the new book, part of the reason I wrote it is because we're about to have a generation's worth of institutional turnover, maybe in only a few years. And
mm,
the values and ethos of those new institutions that we build is up for grabs. We as
mm,
founders, as we harness this new power to amplify our creativity, to amplify our reach and our span of control, we therefore are also amplifying our moral responsibility for the outcome. Now, a single person with a model is going to be able to affect millions or billions of lives. So gear up. And so I think it's very important that those organizations, those institutions be properly governed, both for longevity, but also for integrity.
Well, it makes me wonder what AI would say when a founder asks and say, "Hey, Eric, is this new book? Is it bullshit or is it relevant for my company?"
Yeah. I'm
Um,
going to ask it right now. Let's find out.
yeah, I think that's what people are going to do to fact check you, right? Would
All
be,
right, let's find out. Let's fact check it. All right. Claude is on the case while we talk. I'll tell you what he says. Give it a minute because it's doing the reasoning model.
oh, the
It
hot
doesn't
takes
really know.
model.
It's worth taking seriously. Its research suggests that companies anchored in a deep and durable mission are 6 times more likely to survive and consistently outperform peers. That's a falsifiable claim, which is more than most business books offer. Thanks, Claude. The honest skeptic's case. The blurb parade. This is amazing. The blurb parade. Reid Hoffman, Mark Cuban, Seth Godin, Harvard professors is impressive, but it also means the book hasn't really been challenged yet in public discourse. The real test is whether the governance mechanisms he proposes actually hold up when VCs, acquirers, or market pressure push back. Yeah. And it says the lean startup methodology was also widely praised. And in practice, many companies used it as a buzzword while doing the same old thing. Claude's pretty smart. Those are all completely legit, completely legit. Now, if I gave it my manuscript and I asked it to evaluate based on the actual research, of course, we get a more substantive answer. But there has not been that much written about it yet. So it's having to go based on the public discourse. That's pretty fun.
Yeah, maybe the more we podcast and discuss, we will train the data
Yeah,
set
we'll learn
to
it. Well,
be
listen,
more positive. Yeah.
yeah, well, to me, that's very positive because what
Mm,
I don't want from anybody is to be
mm,
taken blindly on faith. This goes
mm,
back to Lean Startup 101. I'm a believer in the scientific method and scientific theories, which means they need to make falsifiable predictions and people need to learn the principles for themselves and just test. Does it work the way it promises? And this book makes a ton of empirical predictions, specific techniques that if you do them, specific things will happen and people can try it for themselves. So to me, the fact that the language model is already saying this is something worth taking seriously, it's something worth trying and be skeptical is good. That's my attitude too. Everyone should be skeptical. Everyone should put the ideas to the test for themselves.
and maybe the cloud is personalized to your persona, right? So maybe someone
Oh
who's
yeah,
more
someone else better do it.
skeptical.
Yeah, you need a
Yeah,
more
who knows,
skeptic. I
right?
could ask it for a more skeptical take next time. That's
No,
fine.
it's okay.
I
We'll
love
do
it.
that another time. Well, on that note, Eric, I'd love to summarize the 3 big takeaways I got from this conversation. First of all, thanks so much for sharing, not just about why you wrote your first book, The Lean Startup, but also your reaction to it,
Mm.
your personal identity shift as a result of it. That's just such an interesting component because so many people read the book, but don't really understand the author and how your life was changed because of that book. Second, thanks for sharing about your new book, about how there are certain principles around incentives, corruption, the push and pull of the various stakeholders like investors, founders, employees. And you talk about how that translates to not just longevity and sustainability of the company, but also the performance of the company, which is something that, of course, people like B corporations and social enterprises have made some arguments. Your book that I read has made that argument in a different and much more founder centric way, which is a powerful framing because everything else is very theoretical or academic, a strong push for us to consider thoroughly. And lastly, thanks for sharing about applying these book principles, both the lean startup as well as your current research about incorruptibility in the age of AI and acceleration, whether that set of findings hold true are even more important. Is it fossil viable? Is it going to get brutally eaten by AI? I think there's some dynamics that we're still figuring out together. So thank you so much for sharing all your thoughts.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate your time. And yeah, pleasure for coming on the show.
Thank you for listening to Brave. If you enjoyed this episode, please share the podcast with your friends and colleagues. We would also appreciate you leaving a rating or review. Head over to www.bravesea.com for member content, resources, and community. Stay well and stay brave.